Today, we have Greg Brujink and his wife that are with us all the way from Thailand. So today is going to be an awesome time just hearing from God's Word. Greg's with ABT, make sure I get it, ABTS? Yep. Ministries and ministering out there in Thailand to nationals, training them as well, getting more schooling at the seminary that's out there. Just a great ministry that we're so glad to be able to partner with. And if you were here for Sunday School Hour, you were able to, in the adult side, you were able to hear an update on that. So we're just pleased at what God's been doing out there, far regions. And so today, now, you get to hear him preach and bring God's Word to us. So, Greg, if you'd come.
Good morning. Am I on? Okay, good. Pastor Brandon said I could take as much time as I wanted, so you can take that up with him later. For those of you who weren't here during Sunday school, I do want to just do a quick introduction. Thank you, Pastor Brandon, for that short one. We are with Asia Biblical Theological Seminary, and what our goal is to provide theological training for pastors and other Asian leaders and missionaries all throughout Asia. So we have a number of different sites, like 10 different sites in 5 different countries, and we go and we teach courses to them. So I teach Old Testament, and the reason why I bring that up is that we are going to be in the New Testament today. And if you could please turn to Hebrews chapter 11, that would be great. I bring it up because as an Old Testament professor, every time I preach from the New Testament, I get in trouble. Like afterwards, people are like, "What? Why? What?" It's like I am obligated now to only preach from the Old Testament. But this is like a secret Trojan horse because we are actually going to be talking about the Old Testament almost the entire time. But we will be in the New Testament. So hopefully you're not confused by all of that. But we are going to be looking at Hebrews chapter 11. It's a really well-known chapter. And often is called the Great Hall of Faith. I'm going to jump around just a little bit, and we're going to go and spend a lot of time in the Old Testament. So just kind of buckle up for what's going to happen, okay? So I want to start, and I saw right out in the front, in the foyer, you actually have this up. In the first verse it says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible." Okay, so it starts out and it tells us what faith is, right? Kind of. So our first point here, is this working? Oh, sorry, I forgot to introduce my family. This is what happens when you forget the clicker. This is my family. Rachel's taking the younger kids out, and Isaac is 6, Hannah's 4, and then Rachel, she'll come back in, and Christian and Abby are right over here. Thanks so much for having us. So, back to Hebrews 11. What is faith? Okay, so it says right at the beginning, it gives us a definition. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And this is not going to be a systematic theology lecture or anything like that. But I'm going to suggest to you that definition of faith, when we read Hebrews chapter 11, and we read it in light of the whole Old Testament and the things that it talks about, is actually really complicated. It's not as simple as you think it is when you first start reading this. And we have a tendency to read this chapter in a certain way that I think is not right. So I want to jump to the beginning of chapter 12 and see what that says. It says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God." So we have a beginning, and it says, this is what faith is. Then all the stuff we're about to talk about that we haven't gotten to yet. And then it says, so we have this great cloud of witnesses. So the first thing I want to address before we even get into Hebrews chapter 11 is that whole cloud of witnesses idea. We have this kind of mentality sometimes, maybe depending on how you've heard this taught or what kind of teaching you had growing up, that when we read Hebrews chapter 11, it's like, even though we say it's the great hall of faith, we almost read it like it's the great hall of faithfulness. Like these are the heroes of the faith that we should aspire to be like these people, right? And then we get to the beginning of chapter 12, and it says, now we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. Like, here's all of these people that are kind of like cheering us on to be as faithful as them. Now, the word there, witnesses, is actually where we get the word martyr from. Martyros it just means like more in the sense of when you are in a courtroom and someone is called to the witness stand, they testify something, they say something true, hopefully, right? And so really all it's saying when it says we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses is not necessarily people cheering us on to be great people, but it's someone who has spoken the truth about something, right? So now the question is, we have a definition of faith. We know that these people are speaking truth about something. The question is, what exactly is going on in Hebrews chapter 11? And that's where I think it gets interesting if you read it in the light of the Old Testament. So let's jump back to Hebrews 11. I told you we'd be jumping around a lot. And we start to read. It says, by faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. Okay? So first story here is a little unusual, just because in the Old Testament, if we look at this story, we actually never know exactly why God accepted Abel's sacrifice and not Cain's. It says something about it here. It gives us sheds a little light on the story, but it's actually a little bit of a confusing story. Okay, so the next one, it says, where are we? It is verse 5. By faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. And without faith it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. By faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. So far, I think we're kind of tracking with this. So Abel was a good guy. I think we can agree on that. What we know about him, he was probably a good guy. Enoch, he's a good guy. And then it starts mentioning Noah. Noah, he was an okay guy most of the time, right? He was commended as righteous. He builds the ark, and that's what he, is commended for in here. But then later on in his life, after the flood, it got a little ugly. I think we can all agree if we know the story. Okay, so now it gets to be a little more difficult. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in the tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundation, whose designer and builder is God. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. So this is where I start to have some problems with Hebrews chapter 11. And I think if we are reading closely and we know our Old Testament, we might start to have some problems here. Because Abraham and Sarah are commended as having faith, and they were not very good people, honestly. When we look at their lives, when we look at Abraham and the things he did some things right, and he did most of the things wrong, right? So it says that he went, but first of all, he took Lot with him when he wasn't supposed to. That ended in disaster. And then when we start reading as we go along, it says, because from him all these people came, as innumerable as the sands on the seashore. Abraham was really a mess in a lot of ways. He receives this promise, and he's always trying to take matters into his own hands. First thing that happens, they encounter some danger. They're in a land, and he thinks the king is going to kill him. And so he lies about who Sarah, his wife, is. And then he does it again, exactly the same thing later on in his life. He gets a woman pregnant that's not his own wife in order to try and make the promise of God happen, right? If we really follow the arc of Abraham's story, it's mostly bad, right? You can argue that as he goes through life, things get better, and he ultimately does in faith. He's willing to sacrifice Isaac. But if we were to look as people here today, and we were going to say, let's think of someone that is worthwhile of being commended for their faith and their faithfulness in service. If it was a guy with like a resume like Abraham, we'd probably not really consider that guy. He was a disaster as a person. And then it commends Sarah for her faith. It says she believed, even though her womb was dry, this couldn't happen. But what did Sarah actually do? When God told her, she laughed, right? And so I'm reading this, and I'm starting to get a little confused, right? Because these people are being commended for faith, and they're not the kind of people that we think of as faithful. So I'm a missionary, so I believe there's some kind of contractual obligation somewhere that I have to use a missionary story in every sermon. So here it is. I think of, we're talking heroes of the faith, and I think modern heroes of the faith, we think about like Hudson Taylor, founded the China Inland Mission, evangelized the interior of China. There's so many biographies about this guy. You think Amy Carmichael cared for orphans in India, and the list goes on and on and on and on. And we hold up these people as heroes of the faith. And I just want you to kind of put a bookmark in your mind there, because the reason why we're talking about this, and it's going to make a little more sense in just a minute, is that I think we have this separation that we make between a certain kind of amazing hero of the faith and us, right? That they're somehow different than we are. That Abraham, because he's in Hebrews chapter 11, was somehow different than we are. But I really don't think that's true. And as I said, he's a little bit of a mess. We're going to skip ahead a little bit. Verse 23, it says, by faith, Moses. Well, let's just stop that story right there, okay? Anything that starts with by faith, Moses, we already probably are a little confused about, right? The guy also was a disaster. He did amazing things through the power of God, but personally, as a person you would think of as demonstrating faith, you wouldn't look to that person. But the pinnacle for me in this chapter is a couple verses later, starting in verse 32. Right before we left Chiang Mai, where we live, I was able to preach a series on the book of Judges for our international church. Our pastor that we had just left to move back to America, so we had to have some people to fill in for things. So I was able to preach just a short 3-week series. And I actually talked about Hebrews chapter 11 in light of Judges because this is so confusing to me. So in verse 32, he's talked all about all these faithful people. These people had faith, these people had faith. And it's been a little confusing, but this is where it just goes off the rails confusing, right? It says, and what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of the fire, escaped the edge of the sword, etc., etc. Okay, so here's why I have a problem. First one, Gideon. Okay, what more can I say? Here's this guy Gideon. He did some amazing thing. Well, Gideon, when you start reading in the book of Judges, he is actually hiding, right? It says that foreign powers have taken over Israel. They're taking everything. They're devouring the land like locusts, it says. And we meet Gideon, and he's inside of a wine press. It's basically a large bowl where you would stomp the grapes to make the wine. But what it says that he's doing, he's actually trying to thresh and beat in grain, right? So this is kind of like a weird, if you're not familiar with the agricultural practices, it might not sound weird. But basically what he was doing is he was trying to separate the grain and the chaff So you beat it, and it makes all the wheat grains fall down, and then you use a pitchfork and you throw it up in the air, and the wind blows away the chaff and keeps the good stuff. So if you'll imagine with me standing in a giant bowl where there's no wind, throwing things up in the air, hoping the wind will blow it, it doesn't work very well, right? And that's where we meet Gideon. He's so afraid that people are going to steal his food that he's basically hiding in there, doing something that makes no sense. And he's greeted by the angel of the Lord. It says, "Greetings, man of valor." He's like, what? And Gideon responds, if you read the story, he basically has no clue. Like, he's just, who are you talking to? And the angel of the Lord says, well, the Lord is with you. And he says, well, if the Lord is with us, then why are we in captivity? Why are these people taking over? So immediately, he's a man with severe doubts, right? Like, the whole story of Gideon is a man who's always doubting. And God says, well, I am going to use you to deliver Israel from these people. And he says, well, why don't you I have a test for you, the fleece test, right? We're not supposed to do this. This is not like an example that we should have fleeces. The whole point of it in the story is that he's not supposed to be doing this. He's a bad guy. And he's doubting. And he says, well, God, if you're really going to use me to deliver, then do this with the fleece. And God does it. And he says, okay. One more time, okay? Just do it again, and then I'll know for sure you're going to use me, okay? Well, why do I bring this up? It says, what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, that amazing faithful man, you know? So that's a little weird. So why am I talking about this? I think there's something going on here that we're missing. Because if we're really reading this in light of the Old Testament, the way that is my kind of default tendency to read it, it doesn't make sense. If it is, we should aspire to be like these faithful people. It doesn't make sense, right? We're going to talk about the other ones later. I think, again, all I have to really mention is the name of Samson in this list. And if you know anything about Samson, you start to wonder if the person who wrote Hebrews chapter 11 had ever actually read the Old Testament. If they're commending Samson as like a person of faith. He was a total disaster, right, of a man. The whole point of the story of Samson is to show us how far the people of Israel had fallen because he was so bad. And here he is in Hebrews chapter 11 and the list of the heroes of faith. So what is going on here? What is happening? What does it actually mean? So I have to think when it's commending these people for faith, it's definitely not faithfulness, right? It is faith in something, in someone, okay? Which sounds obvious, but it's a very, very important difference. I don't think Hebrews chapter 11 is telling us, giving us a list and saying, these people were amazing people. They're the Hudson Taylors and the Amy Carmichaels of their day, and you should aspire as Christians to be like these people because they were so amazing. I mean, you read the Old Testament and you read Hebrews chapter 11, it cannot possibly be the case because they were not good people, right? They were not the people you would make the head of your Christian organization or an elder in your church or whatever, you know, like they just would not meet those requirements in the way that we think about them. And so I have to think that, and this is going to be a little bit of a dangerous statement here, I have to think that the way we think about that faithfulness doesn't matter to God like we often think it does. The people that he used were not good people. But he used them, right? And he called them to do something, and they stepped out and believed that God could do it. And that's what they're commended for. They're not commended for a great character. Again, Samson's the pinnacle of that example of someone who morally in his choices was a disaster. But if you read the story of Samson very closely, he's one of the only people in the whole Old Testament, and definitely in the book of Judges, who speaks directly to God as almost like a friend. He says, God, give me strength to do this. And he speaks directly to God. And yet he's like a sinful mess, right? And so I have to think that what they're being commended for here is something different than we usually think of. Not for being amazing followers of God, being amazing Christians, but for having faith that God would do amazing things. Okay, so when we think about this, I ask the question, well, who does God use? And again, we think of the great heroes of the faith. But I would put forward that God uses different people. So first of all, I would say that God, for example, used Abraham. It says that he told Abraham to go, and Abraham went. He believed that God would do what he promised. Now, it was not an unflinching belief, as we already reviewed. Like Abraham, for most of his life, really was always trying to take that promise into his own hands and make God's promise happen. But he did believe that God would fulfill that promise. He was just unsure how, right? Romans chapter 4 also commends him for that faith. And sometimes you'll read it and you're like, wow, it doesn't seem like he always trusted God. I think he did believe that God would do it, but he just felt like he had to help a little bit. But God uses people who are not amazing, who are not great, who are weak, who are sinful, who are doubtful, who don't really know what's going on. Those are the people that God uses, and that's what is in Hebrews chapter 11. So think again of Abraham, of a guy who was told to go somewhere, and he had a lot of doubts about what God was doing, but he did it anyway. And so I wanted to tell you a story of a guy from our ministry in ABTS. I had the opportunity to teach in a refugee camp. We have a group of students in a refugee camp on the border with Myanmar, and it's called the Mela Refugee Camp. And the guy on the far left with the crutches, his name is Po Day Day. And I think he's an example, probably a good example of maybe a modern day Abraham. You could see, if you look down below, his legs are not fully formed. He walks with crutches. He has severe disabilities. But his role in the camps is that he travels around to a lot of these different refugee camps. There are actually many refugee camps for Burmese and Karen refugees that come over from Myanmar, and they live in these refugee camps. This one has 50,000 people in it. It's been there for about 30 years. So it's like this whole thing, and there's many of these refugee camps. And his job, if you want to call it a job, he travels around, and he's an evangelist. He goes around to all of these different camps, and he tells the truth of Jesus to people. And I know from talking with him, he felt God's call to do that, but he didn't believe that he could do it, right? Because of all the people that God would choose, why would God choose him to do that? It's difficult for him to get around. It's not easy for him to do that work in particular. And maybe even people look down on him because of his physical disability, his weakness. But he still believed God, and he still went, and that's what he does. And what I don't want you to get from this, again, I've talked to Po Day Day. He was in my class. He did okay, not exceptionally well. So I don't want you to think like he is like this most amazing person you would ever meet. He's a regular guy. But God called him to do something in the midst of weakness, and he did it. He does it. He's made the choice to do that, right? So I think of another person. I think of Gideon that I mentioned before, a doubtful person. God calls Gideon to do something, and he's not sure that he's the right person for the job. Now, there's two people in this picture. The one on the right is, his name is Jonathan. He actually works in the finance department for ABTS, for the seminary. But we're actually going to talk about Joy. She's on the left. She's from the Philippines. And God called her to do something, and that was to move from the Philippines and to go to Thailand and to do missions. And she was severely doubtful, right? To hear her talk about it, she could not believe. She was very, very shy, timid, but she works in a small village in south of Thailand, the north of Thailand, sorry, a little bit south of Chiang Mai. And she has lived in that village for a long time. She has made really great friends. She has worked with the women, and she has made great advances for the gospel in a very forgotten part of Thailand. Again, is she a nice person? Yes, I actually really like Joy a lot. She was a great student, and it's a pleasure to know her. But she's not a person that I would think someone's going to write a biography about or something like that. Why do I mention that? I'm not tearing people down. I'm just saying that every one of us is normal, right? In America, we have kind of this celebrity culture where we raise people up, and I think we can do that in the church too. These people are normal. They've been called to do something by God, and they have doubts. They have sin in their life. They have questions. They have all fears. Joy, if you talk to her, was very fearful about moving to another country to do this work. But she did. She stepped out in faith, not because she is an amazing person, but because she believed that God would do something, right? She had faith not in herself and her own faithfulness. She had faith that God would work in his power to change someone, and that he was calling her to be a part of that, right? And then the last one, this guy, his name is Siravuth An. And he's actually our coordinator for our site in the Philippines that's opening up next month for ABTS. And I want to talk about him just because he's like the most average guy you could ever meet, not in a bad way. But he's a really nice guy. He grew up in Cambodia, and he felt God calling him to do things. He worked with World Vision for a number of years, and now he runs a children's home, an orphanage in Cambodia, and he wanted to further his education, so he's taking classes with us, but he's also coordinating things. He's a really, really, really great guy. He's very faithful, and he's just so completely normal. Why do I mention this? Because all around the world, there are normal people. And God is using normal people. And Hebrews chapter 11 is about normal people, right? That's why I wanted to talk about this thing at the beginning, faith, what faith actually is. We believe it's something that we can't necessarily see. Let's read it again, just to get the wording correct. The assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And I believe what Hebrews chapter 11 is saying all throughout this chapter is that these people were not amazing people, but they believed that God would do something. If you read what their faith is actually commended, what they're commended for, that's what it talks about. It doesn't say, therefore, follow ye Abraham, he was the amazing father of the faith, or follow Gideon and Barak and Samson, because they were amazing people. No, they had faith in an amazing God. So then we get to the beginning of chapter 12, going back there. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, people who speak the truth about something, right? People who are speaking about God's faithfulness to work, I believe is what it is telling us. Let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, because that is what they did. They were sinful. They had things too. And let us run with endurance the race set before us, looking to who? Looking to Jesus, who was the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising its shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So the person that is commended for faithfulness is not any of these people, it is Jesus. It says, they laid aside these things, they believed that God would do something, but the person that we look to is Jesus. He's the author, the perfecter of our faith. We believe that through his sacrifice, we can have relationship with God, not because we are amazing people, but because God is an amazing God. Because God has power to work and to do things in our lives, and even when we have maybe limitations like Po Day Day, or we have fears like Joy had, or we're just an average person, because we all are. God uses everyone. So what does this mean for us? I want to go back to the idea of heroes of the faith, to the idea of like these modern missionary heroes. Because when I first became a Christian, I felt a strong call to missions really early on, and I was like devouring, these missionary biographies, read about Hudson Taylor and Amy Carmichael, and all these people I mentioned before. And there's something really interesting about reading these biographies is that maybe there's one or two, but most of these biographies don't tell you about the time that Hudson Taylor had a fight with his wife, or the time he yelled at his kid, or whatever it is, right? Because no one wants to read about that. We want to be inspired because these were amazing people. But really, the truth is, Hudson Taylor, God worked through him. Amazing things happened, but he was just a guy. Amy Carmichael, she was an amazing person. She's inspiring, but she was just a woman, right? She got irritable when she was tired. She, I'm sure, was impatient with the million orphans hanging around at times. And we can hold people up in our minds and not have a really true picture of them and how God works. God doesn't work through amazing people. God works in spite of who everyone is, right? And so, why am I saying all of this? I always like to end this kind of thing by talking about the Great Commission. Matthew chapter 28 says, therefore, go and bring the gospel to all nations, baptizing them, all this thing. I think you guys know the passage, and it's the great missionary call. But when you really think about the disciples, you think about the people in the Old Testament, you really look at yourself, at least for me, and think that God has put on us to bring his message to the nations. It seems like an insanely stupid plan, right? Like God would entrust us to bring the gospel, to bring his message to the nations. People who doubt, who fear, who are sinful, who get irritable, who wear out, who wonder if they're accomplishing anything. That's who God calls to build his church. And you kind of wonder, what are you doing, God? Why? If we really are honest with ourselves about who we are as people, it seems kind of crazy, right? Just like all of Hebrews chapter 11, when you actually know the Old Testament stories, it seems crazy. But God has always been working and will always continue to work in spite of who we are as people. He, for some unfathomable reason, you said in the Bible, who's given counsel to the Lord? Or we sang it this morning, right? I think this is probably the deepest example of that God would entrust us to bring this message. It's not the plan I would choose because I know who I am. I know my struggles. I know the doubts and the fears that I have. And I think if we're all honest with each other, we can speak the same way. That God would invite us to be a part of his kingdom work is insane, but he has chosen to do it, right? And what does that mean for us today? It means, you can have a missionary come and speak, and you can read the missionary biographies and think, oh, that's not me. Well, the truth is, everyone is you, right? We are all the same. We struggle with the same stuff, right? We don't necessarily have some special gifting. Hudson Taylor or Abraham, they weren't like a completely different type of person. They were you, but God called those people to do something. And they believed that God was powerful enough to do it in spite of who they were, in spite of their weaknesses, in spite of their struggles. And so that's the call to you today. What is God calling you to do? What kingdom work is God asking you to be a part of? And you might say, well, that's not for me. I don't feel that calling. Well, we're all invited, if we are Christians, into God's kingdom work in some way. So find out what it is. And maybe you do have doubts. Maybe you do have fears. Maybe you do have a struggle with some sin. And just ask God to work in that, to fill you with the power of his Spirit, to do that work in spite of yourself, because he is faithful, because he is powerful. And that is what I believe Hebrews chapter 11 is really telling us, that it is not the amazingness of these people or the amazingness of these heroes of the faith that we love to read about and be inspired by. It is the fact that God, in his power, in his faithfulness, through his grace and the power of his Spirit, chose to work through sinful people. And he's doing it today. He's doing it right here. And that's hopefully, I always say a message like this is a little dangerous because it can either be encouraging or really discouraging. So I come up here and I tell you all that you're bad people, and then I get to walk away and drive away back to Michigan, and then leave for Thailand. But I hope it's not discouraging. I hope honesty is helpful, right? I hope that being honest about who we are allows us to be free enough to trust God to do what he will do. Because it is only through his power, only through his grace, that anything is ever accomplished for his kingdom, whether it's in Thailand or in China or Africa or some amazing evangelism crusade or right here in this church. God is working. And through the power of his Spirit, things will happen through you, through the things that you have, the talents, the passions, the desires. What is God calling you to do for his kingdom. Ask him to reveal that to you and believe with faith that he can work because he always chooses to work through people who are weak.